Alright, so in the last video, we went into some of the political context behind Bitcoin, why it came on the scene when it did, why it's important now, right? We've had interest rates that are quite top-down, academic, theoretical, state-driven, and they've been around zero for close to a decade. If you're lucky, sometimes they're negative. We've had increasingly bizarre economic phenomena going on to the point where people are kind of like wondering what's going on. This doesn't seem quite right. And in the first video, we said that Bitcoin is valuable because it's useful and it's scarce. It's the first implementation of digital scarcity. That's a great short definition. I'll have to expand on it for all kinds of videos, but the first expansion I got to make is that Bitcoin is not the first implementation of digital scarcity. It's the first ground-up, incentive-driven, violence-resistant implementation of digital scarcity. You can look at earlier attempts to implement digital scarcity, right? When did this first happen with digital goods and value? Well, think back to Napster and file sharing and MP3s. An MP3 is a digital good. It's very useful because people can share them. They can be sent. It's a lot cheaper to send an MP3 than to etch it onto a record or a CD and put it on an 18-wheeler and send it across the country, right? That's quite an advantage. But the problem with that lack of scarcity you get because it's a digital good is it ruins a lot of legacy business models. But that's not really true today, right? So there was an adjustment phase and you had all these lawsuits and everything. But today, people buy and sell MP3s all the time. There is still a certain scarcity. There's a certain convenience. It's imposed. It's top down. It's through things like DRM, through devices, through permissions, all of that stuff. And it's usually controlled by some sort of central authority. It works. It's good enough for what it does. Of course, it's not perfect, right? You still have file sharing. I don't want to get into the ethics of, digital property or any of that. I'm just talking about the technology. You have digital scarcity attempts that are successful enough in limited use cases. Now, they're not really successful enough for money. Think about the scarcity model for money today. The US dollar, for example, is that an empirical, practical, incentive-driven scarcity model that just happens to emerge from some complexity? Absolutely not. It's completely academic. It's completely top-down. It's completely theoretical. You have these guys at the Federal Reserve who all have to meet certain criteria and wear certain robes and make certain chants to reassure everybody that money is this certain thing. And these clowns, they couldn't even tell you what, for example, the money supply of the US dollar. The people who were supposed to know don't even know. We have no idea. All they can do is guess, have certain models, give them certain other fancy names to make them also sound academically important. But it's this other very top-down, academic-driven sort of scarcity attempt that can be good enough under certain circumstances. The problem is those circumstances are starting to deteriorate. So it's probably not going to be good enough for much longer. So compare that to money before the US dollar, or let's say before the US dollar went off the gold standard fully in 1971. What's the monetary policy of gold? Is it academic? Was there some professor who just had the best idea of what gold should be and then everybody just believed him for thousands of years? No. It was incentive driven. It was based on the real world, practical considerations and limitations. Gold has a certain supply. It has a certain scarcity. The problems of extracting gold are real and shared by any humans who try to do it. It requires, I'll even say, a certain proof of work to obtain gold. Now, it's not to say supply doesn't vary, and there's also some short-term issues with that. However, in the long run, people have always preferred those issues to the manufactured issues of academics and people who would otherwise try to control the money supply. So with Bitcoin, the model is much more like gold. It's not the same thing. There's still limitations to the gold model, right? Unfortunately, governments have had gold's number for millennia. The Romans could shave coins. The United States can toss out the gold standard. The United States can just make holding private gold illegal. There's all sorts of things that can be done with gold. And some of those things can be done with Bitcoin too. It's just a bit more complicated. It has some other obstacles. So we've now seen how Bitcoin's not just an implementation of digital scarcity. It's this violence-resistant, ground-up, non-academic, non-top-down implementation of digital scarcity. Well, how? How does Bitcoin do that? Well, part of the equation is decentralization. So it's not like the Federal Reserve, which controls the scarcity or the monetary policy of the US dollar, and they have certain incentives which might not line up with you. It's not like the RIAA or Apple Store or whoever's selling MP3s that are implementing a certain level of scarcity on those files. With Bitcoin, it is a decentralized approach. It's part of the technology. It also deals with the real world. It's iterative. It's practical application. Decentralization, though, is such a loaded word in Bitcoin. What I mean to say is that there's no single party who controls it, and the net weight of multiple parties is enough that if they all share the same incentives, you can expect certain behavior. Even that's super complicated. There's not great metrics for it. There's not great consensus on it. Certain aspects of Bitcoin are anything but decentralized. So when you see that just kind of thrown around, try to figure out what they really mean. Decentralization is important, but it's a means to an end. The point of Bitcoin is that it's a violence-resistant money. It's not violence-proof. You could be tortured and somebody could steal it from you. There are things that powerful enough states could do to make it super inconvenient, but I'll say that it is violence-resistant. More so than something like gold, right? Which is also violence-resistant, but it still gets confiscated a lot. It still gets controlled a lot. Governments have thousands of years of success of messing with gold. Bitcoin is violence-resistant and digital. So I would say it's actually, it's more than just a marginal improvement in the property of violence resistance compared to things like gold and silver. It's new. Governments will still have to figure out some sort of way to do it. And governments are also increasingly in a precarious financial position. It's this real emperor has no clothes moment where everybody knows that something is wrong. And you have this competing, totally transparent monetary policy in Bitcoin, where anybody can audit the supply, anybody can know that this stuff isn't being printed ad infinitum and whatever else states are doing. We still have to get into technically how that's accomplished, so I've gone on some more, but it's important to get that's the distinction, right? It is violence-resistant scarcity. It comes from certain properties of how it was designed, but not just how it was designed, how it practically works in the real world, and how all the stakeholders, all of the incentives work with each other. How that's ultimately ensured is through mining, and how Bitcoin transactions are processed, and how Bitcoin is issued. So we'll get into that in the next video. In the meantime, though, remember, decentralization is important. You should understand it. But the revolutionary aspect of Bitcoin isn't just it's decentralized, right? States have been decentralized. Decentralization has existed in all sorts of interesting ways. The important part about Bitcoin is that it is violence resistant. And decentralization is an important part of that. It's not the only part of that. We'll look into the technical ways of how that works in the next video.